Have you ever seen something wrong happen in public and done nothing? Not because you're a bad person, because you were tired, because it wasn't your fight, because someone else would handle it. Most of us have been that person. This is a story about a Friday afternoon on Atlanta's bus number 23. A driver following protocol. A mother who didn't argue. A 9-year-old boy who put his book down and went quiet because he'd learned that's what you did when the world decided you were inconvenient. And a 17-year-old girl in the back of the bus who almost didn't look up from her phone. Almost. Subscribe if you're new. Share this tonight. Stay with me. Because what she does when she looks up is going to make you think about the last time you looked away. Diana Foster had been navigating systems her whole life, not because she wanted to, because Elijah required it. Insurance systems, school systems, medical systems, transportation systems. Every system had rules. Every system had a person on the other side who either saw her son or saw a case number. She'd learned to tell the difference in 30 seconds. She'd learned it the hard way. The pediatrician who'd spoken to her instead of Elijah, when Elijah was right there in the room. Old enough to understand. Old enough to answer his own questions. Old enough to deserve to be addressed directly. The school administrator who'd said, "We'll do our best to accommodate him." With the specific, practiced smile of someone who had already decided what their best looked like. The insurance company that had denied his wheelchair upgrade 3 times before approving it. Not because he didn't need it, because the forms hadn't been filled out in exactly the right sequence. She'd learned to fill out forms correctly. She'd learned to smile at the people who saw case numbers. She'd learned to hold her breath in the 30 seconds before she found out which kind of person she was dealing with. She was very tired of holding her breath. Elijah was 9 years old and knew more about the phantom toll booth than most adults knew about anything. He could tell you why Milo's journey mattered. He could explain the doldrums in 3 sentences. It's the place where nothing happens because you forget to think. Most people visit but don't know they're there. He could recite the rules of Digitopolis from memory. He could not walk without his wheelchair. He did not consider this the most important thing about himself. The world sometimes disagreed. He'd developed a specific, quiet patience about that disagreement. Not acceptance, patience. There was a difference he understood better than most adults. Acceptance meant it was okay. Patience meant he was waiting for the world to catch up. Friday had been a good day. His PT session went well. 45 minutes of work that was hard and specific and left him tired in the way that meant something had happened. Some small increment of progress in the long, slow project of building strength in a body that required more effort than most. His therapist had said, "He's getting stronger," not as encouragement, as fact. Diana had held that sentence on the drive to the bus stop. He's getting stronger. That was always the whole point. Every form filled out correctly. Every insurance denial appealed. Every administrator smiled at. Every system navigated carefully and patiently and without complaint. All of it pointed toward that sentence. He's getting stronger. She'd helped Elijah onto bus number 23 at 5:47 p.m. She'd watched him settle into the wheelchair space. She'd watched him open the phantom toll booth to the page he'd marked with a folded corner. She'd exhaled. They were going home. Then she saw the cart. Someone's merchandise. Boxes stacked carefully in the wheelchair space. The specific, anxious arrangement of someone carrying things they were worried about breaking. She looked at the driver. The driver's name was Ray, 44 years old, 11 years on this route. He wasn't a bad man. He was a tired man at the end of a long Friday who had a protocol for exactly this situation and had used it before and had never had to think too hard about what it cost the person on the other side of it. He looked at the cart. He looked at Diana. He looked at his schedule. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm going to need you to exit the vehicle. We can't accommodate the wheelchair at this time." Diana looked at him. "The next bus," she said. 40 minutes, he said. "I know, I'm sorry." He meant it. That was the hardest part. He wasn't being cruel. He was being procedural. And procedural in this moment felt exactly like cruel. Elijah had been listening. He always listened. He put the phantom toll booth face down in his lap. He looked at his mother. He didn't ask why. He didn't protest. He looked at her with a specific, patient expression of a 9-year-old who understood what was happening and had decided that understanding it quietly was the only thing he could do. He'd been in situations like this before. Not this exact one, but situations where the world required him to wait while it figured out how to fit him in. He'd learned to go quiet in those moments. Diana had never wanted that for him. She stood in the aisle. She needed 1 second. Just 1 second before she decided what came next. In the back of the bus, a 17-year-old girl named Kezia Thompson had her headphones on, sat prep book in her bag, phone in her hand. She'd heard everything. She hadn't looked up. Not yet. His name was Marcus Webb, 52 years old. He sold handmade ceramics at the weekend market on Peachtree. Bowls, cups, small sculptures that took him 3 days each to make, and that he carried wrapped in newspaper and packed in boxes that he handled the way you handled things that were both fragile and necessary. He'd had a bad week. 2 pieces broken during setup on Tuesday. 1 customer who'd promised to return and hadn't. A Tuesday market that had earned him $47 after 6 hours in the sun. Friday was supposed to be better. It hadn't been better. He'd sold 2 cups and a bowl. He was going home with $68 and a cart full of work he was terrified of breaking, because breaking meant 3 days of making. And he didn't have 3 days right now. He had rent due on Monday. He hadn't noticed Diana when she boarded. He'd been watching his cart. He watched his cart the way Diana watched Elijah, constantly, peripherally, with the specific anxiety of someone responsible for something fragile, in an environment designed for neither of them. When the driver spoke, he'd heard his own name. "Sir, I need you to move your cart." He'd looked up. He'd seen Diana. He'd seen the wheelchair. He'd looked at his boxes. "It's fragile," he said. "If I move it, sir," Ray said, "I can't just—" He stopped. He looked at Diana again, at Elijah, at the book face down in the boy's lap. He understood what he was looking at. He just didn't know what to do about it without losing something he couldn't afford to lose. That was the problem. Not cruelty, not selfishness. A man trying to protect the only income he had left this week, in a moment that required him to risk it for a stranger. He froze. Most people froze. Ray watched him freeze. Ray had seen this before. Not this exact situation, variations of it. The specific paralyzed moment when 2 people's needs occupied the same space and neither of them was wrong, and the protocol said one of them had to leave. The protocol always pointed to the same person. The person who was already used to being pointed at. Ray had followed the protocol before. He'd followed it today. He'd said the words, "Ma'am, I need you to exit." He'd meant the apology. He'd looked at his schedule. He'd looked at the 43 other passengers on the bus who were all trying to get somewhere and were already running late and were watching him with the specific collective impatience of people who had somewhere to be. He'd made the calculation. 1 passenger versus 43. The protocol agreed with the math. He'd followed it. Diana hadn't moved. Not defiance. She just needed the second she'd asked herself for. 1 second to figure out what her options were. Option 1. Exit. Wait 40 minutes in the October evening with Elijah, who was already tired from PT and who would not complain, but whose body had limits that PT sessions pushed toward. Option 2. Stay, refuse. Make it a confrontation that she'd had before and that never ended the way it should and that left her more exhausted than the waiting. Option 3. Something she hadn't figured out yet. She was still looking for option 3. Kezia Thompson had her headphones on, but the music wasn't playing. It had stopped 3 minutes ago when her playlist ended, and she hadn't noticed because she'd been looking at her phone. She'd heard everything in the silence of headphones that weren't playing anything. She'd heard, "Ma'am, I need you to exit." She'd heard the next bus is 40 minutes. She'd heard Marcus say it's fragile and stop. She'd heard Diana not say anything. She'd heard Elijah not say anything. The silence of a 9-year-old who'd learned to go quiet was the loudest thing on the bus. She looked up. She saw Diana standing in the aisle. She saw Elijah with the book face down in his lap. She saw Marcus frozen next to his cart. She saw 43 people looking at their phones or out the window or at the ceiling. Anywhere except at the woman and her son standing in the aisle. She pulled her headphones off. She stood up. She didn't have a plan. She just couldn't look at her phone anymore. She walked to the front of the bus. Not fast. Not dramatic. The specific, deliberate walk of someone who had decided something and was acting on it before they could talk themselves out of it. 43 people watched her. She didn't look at them. She looked at Marcus. "Sir, I'll help you move it." Marcus looked at her. 17 years old, school uniform, prep book visible in her bag. "It's fragile," he said. "These pieces?" "I know," she said. "I'll be careful." She wasn't asking. She wasn't demanding either. She was just standing there, offering, waiting. Marcus looked at the cart. He looked at Diana. He looked at Elijah. The book was still face down. He didn't move. Not yet. Kezia looked around. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. Then Thomas stood up. 67 years old. Retired teacher. Had been sitting 3 rows back, reading a paperback novel with the specific, unhurried attention of someone who had nowhere urgent to be. He'd been watching since Diana boarded. He'd told himself someone else would handle it. He'd watched nobody handle it. He put his book in his coat pocket. He stood up. He didn't say anything. He just stood. Then Yemi stood. 29 years old, Nigerian, 3 years in Atlanta. Working double shifts at the hospital laundry. Had been on his feet since 5 a.m. and had 40 minutes on this bus that he'd been planning to spend with his eyes closed. He hadn't slept. He'd been listening. He didn't understand every word of the exchange. He understood enough. He stood. Then Sarah stood, 34 years old, 7 months pregnant. The woman next to her said, "Honey, you should sit." "I'm fine," Sarah said. She stood, one by one, not all at once. One by one, which was slower and more deliberate and somehow more powerful than all at once would have been. Because each person who stood had to make the decision individually, had to look at the situation and decide, this is mine to respond to, not someone else's, mine. Each person standing was a separate choice. 12 people total. Then 15, then 20. The bus had gone completely silent. Not the silence of people ignoring something. The silence of people paying full attention. Marcus watched them stand. He'd expected confrontation. Anger directed at him. The specific hot pressure of being the person in the way. That wasn't what this was. Nobody was looking at him with anger. They were just standing. Waiting. Not for him to be shamed into moving. For him to be ready. There was a difference. He felt it. He looked at his cart. He looked at the boxes. He thought about the rent due Monday. He thought about the 2 cups in the bowl. He thought about the $68 in his pocket. Then he looked at Elijah. Elijah was looking at him. Not with anger. Not with judgment. Just looking. The specific, patient look of a 9-year-old who had learned to wait for the world to figure out what it was going to do. Marcus picked up the first box. "Okay," he said. "Okay." Kezia took the second box. Thomas took the third. They moved the cart carefully, methodically, with the specific, collective attention of people who understood that fragile things required care. Nobody dropped anything. Nobody rushed. 3 minutes. The wheelchair space was clear. Diana wheeled Elijah into the space. She locked the wheels. She looked up. At the people still standing. At Kezia. At Thomas. At Yemi. At Sarah with her hand on her stomach. At 20 people who had stood up on a Friday afternoon when they had somewhere to be and didn't have to. She opened her mouth. She closed it. There wasn't a sentence for this. She just nodded. Once. That was enough. People sat back down. The bus was quiet. Ray looked in his mirror. At Diana. At Elijah. At the wheelchair space that was now exactly what it was supposed to be. He put the bus in drive. He drove for 4 blocks before he pulled over. Not a scheduled stop. He just pulled over, put the hazard lights on, sat for a moment. He'd been driving this route for 11 years. He'd seen fights, medical emergencies. A woman give birth on the number 12 in 2019. Not his route, but everyone knew the story. He'd seen people at their worst and their most ordinary, and occasionally their best. He'd followed protocol 900 times. He'd never pulled over after. He looked in the mirror. Diana was facing forward, hand on Elijah's shoulder. The specific, quiet posture of someone who had gotten what they needed and was now trying to return to normal. before normal became too much to hold. Elijah had picked up his book, The Phantom Toll Booth. He'd found his page. He was reading. Ray watched him read for a moment, 9 years old, reading on a city bus after everything that had just happened, finding the page and continuing as if the story was the most important thing. Because maybe for him, right now it was. Ray thought about his daughter, 12 years old, last spring's recital. He'd missed it. Couldn't say no. Bill said yes for him. She'd performed without him. She hadn't said anything when he got home. She'd just gone to her room. He'd known that silence. He was looking at a version of it now. He got out of his seat. 43 passengers watched him walk down the aisle. Nobody said anything. He stopped at the wheelchair space. He looked at the lock mechanism on Elijah's chair. He'd noticed it when Diana boarded, the specific, worn quality of equipment that had been used a long time and maintained carefully, but was starting to show the limits of careful maintenance. The lock wasn't catching fully. He'd noticed. He'd said nothing. He'd been focused on the protocol. He crouched down. He looked at the mechanism. He'd driven buses for 11 years. He knew these chairs. He did that. The lock engaged, solid, clean. He stood. He looked at Elijah. Elijah was looking at him over the top of his book. "It'll hold better now," Ray said. Elijah looked at him. "Thank you," he said. 2 words, completely level. The specific, measured gratitude of a child who had learned to receive things without making the giver feel more than they needed to feel. Ray nodded. He walked back to his seat. He turned off the hazard lights. He pulled back into traffic. Diana hadn't said anything. She'd watched the whole thing without speaking. When Ray walked back, she looked at the lock mechanism. She tested it with her hand. Solid. She looked up at the mirror. Ray's eyes were on the road. She looked at the back of his head for a moment, at a man who had followed a protocol that had hurt her and then gotten out of his seat and fixed something he hadn't been asked to fix. Both things were true simultaneously. She held both. Not forgiveness exactly, something more complicated, the specific adult understanding that people were capable of causing harm and responding to it in the same hour, and that both things counted. Kezia was back in her seat, headphones off now, SAT prep book in her lap unopened. She was looking out the window at Atlanta going by. She wasn't thinking about the SAT. She was thinking about the moment she'd stood up. Not the standing, the second before. The second when she'd seen what was happening and felt the specific, familiar pull of someone else will handle this. She'd felt it. She almost hadn't stood up. That was the part nobody would know. That she'd almost looked back down at her phone. That standing up had required something she hadn't known she had until she used it. She didn't have a name for it yet. She was 17. She'd find the name later. Thomas was reading his paperback again, or pretending to. He was actually thinking about the 30 seconds he'd sat there before he stood. 30 seconds of telling himself someone else would handle it. He'd been a teacher for 32 years. He taught his students about courage. He'd spent 30 seconds on a bus deciding whether to practice what he'd spent 3 decades preaching. He was 67 years old. He was still learning. That was the thing about courage. You didn't learn it once. You learned it every time. Yemi was asleep, finally, head against the window. The specific, immediate sleep of someone whose body had been waiting for permission to stop. He'd stood up on a bus in a country he'd lived in for 3 years and understood imperfectly and had made a decision with incomplete information because some things didn't require complete information. Some things you understood in your body before your brain caught up. He was asleep before his stop. Someone tapped his shoulder when they arrived. He nodded his thanks. He got off. He went home. He didn't think about it as courage. He thought about it as, of course. The bus continued down Peachtree. Stop by stop, people got off. New people got on. The specific, continuous turnover of a city bus on a Friday evening. People arriving with their week on their shoulders. People leaving lighter or not. The ordinary circulation of a city moving itself from one place to another. Nobody who got on after the 5th Street stop knew what had happened. They saw a boy in a wheelchair reading a book. They saw a woman with her hand on his shoulder. They saw a driver doing his job. They didn't see what had happened 20 minutes earlier. That was fine. It had happened anyway. As Elijah read for 6 more stops. He was in the chapter where Milo reaches the castle in the air. He liked this part, not because it was the climax, because of what the castle represented. A place that existed but couldn't be reached the normal way. You had to approach it differently. He thought about that a lot, approaching things differently. He had extensive experience with it. Diana watched him read. She did this sometimes. Watched him read the way you watch something that required no intervention. Pure observation. The specific pleasure of seeing your child fully absorbed in something that had nothing to do with doctors or therapists or insurance forms or bus protocols. Just a boy and a book. She thought about the lock mechanism. About Ray crouching down without being asked. About Kezia walking to the front of the bus without a plan. About Thomas standing without saying a word. About Yemi who hadn't understood everything, but had stood anyway. About Sarah who'd been told to sit down and hadn't. About 20 people on a Friday afternoon choosing to be present for something that wasn't their problem until they decided it was. She thought about all of it. She didn't cry. She was too tired to cry and too grateful not to want to, and the combination of those two things produced a specific, full silence that she sat inside of for the rest of the ride. Marcus was 3 rows back. His cart was in the aisle beside him. He'd moved it carefully from the wheelchair space and found a spot that worked. Not perfectly, but well enough. He was watching out the window. He was thinking about the moment Kezia had said, "I'll help you move it." Not "you need to move it." Not "get out of the way." "I'll help you." 2 words that had changed the entire texture of the moment. He'd been braced for confrontation. He'd received an offer. He didn't know what to do with that. He was still figuring it out. He thought about the $68 in his pocket, about the rent due Monday, about the pieces still in the boxes. None of that had changed. The week was still what it had been. But something else had happened on the bus that he was going to be thinking about for a while. He'd looked at Elijah, at the book, face down, at the patience in that small face, and he'd moved his cart. Not because he'd been shamed into it. Not because he'd had no choice. Because he'd looked at a 9-year-old and understood something about what it cost to wait for the world to make room for you. And he'd decided he didn't want to be one more thing Elijah had to wait for. That decision had cost him nothing. He'd been afraid it would cost him everything. That gap between what he'd feared and what it had actually cost was something he was going to sit with for a long time. Kezia's stop was next. She gathered her bag. Sat prep book still unopened. She'd do it tomorrow. Tonight she was thinking about the second before she stood up. She'd been afraid, not of Marcus or of Ray or of the situation, of being the only one, of standing up and having nobody follow, of making herself visible in a way that might not be worth it. She'd stood anyway, and people had followed. She hadn't known they would. That was the part she couldn't stop thinking about. You didn't get to know in advance. You stood up not knowing. And then you found out. The bus stopped. She stood. She moved toward the door. She passed Diana and Elijah. Elijah looked up from his book. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything. There wasn't anything to say that would be as true as just looking at each other. She got off the bus. She walked home. She thought about the second before. She thought about it for a long time. His shift ended at 8. He parked the bus at the depot. He did the end-of-shift checklist the way he always did. Methodical, automatic, the specific routine of someone who had done the same thing enough times that it required no thought. Except tonight, it required thought. He kept stopping, holding the clipboard, thinking. He thought about the protocol. He knew it by heart. If the designated wheelchair securement area is occupied and cannot be cleared in a reasonable time frame, the operator may request the passenger with mobility equipment to board the next available vehicle. He'd applied it correctly. Every word of it. He'd been within his rights. He'd also been wrong. Both things were true. He was still working out what to do with that. He thought about Elijah. About the book face down in the lap. About "thank you" said in that specific, measured way, the voice of a child who had learned to receive things without making the giver uncomfortable. 9 years old. already fluent in the language of making adults comfortable with what they'd done to him. Ray had a daughter. He knew what it looked like when a child learned things they shouldn't have to learn. He sat in the parked bus for a few minutes after the checklist was done. Just sat. He called his supervisor, not to report the incident, to ask a question. The wheelchair securement protocol, he said. The one about requesting passengers to exit if the space is occupied. What about it? His supervisor said. Has anyone ever reviewed it? Ray said. Whether it's the right call, a pause. It's standard across the system, his supervisor said. I know, Ray said. I'm asking if it's been reviewed. Another pause. I can look into it, his supervisor said. Why? Ray thought about how to answer that. Because I applied it today, he said, and I'm not sure it was the right thing to do. His supervisor was quiet. You followed the protocol, he said. Yes, Ray said. That's what I'm thinking about. He drove home. His daughter was at the kitchen table doing homework, 12 years old. Same age Elijah would be in 3 years. He stood in the doorway and watched her work. She hadn't heard him come in. He watched her for a moment. The specific, absorbed attention of a child working through something difficult, pencil moving, erasing, moving again. She looked up. Dad. Hey, he said. You okay? She said. He looked at her. At 12 years old, who could read him in 3 seconds? Yeah, he said. Had an interesting day. Good interesting or bad interesting, she said. He thought about it. Both, he said. She nodded like that made sense. It did. She went back to her homework. He went to the kitchen. He made dinner. He thought about the protocol. He thought about what it meant to follow rules designed without certain people in mind. He thought about the gap between following correctly and doing right. He'd been thinking about that gap for 20 years. Tonight it had a face, a 9-year-old face with a book in his lap. He wrote an email that night to his union rep, to his supervisor. CC'd the Transit Authority's Accessibility Office, a department he'd never contacted before, had barely known existed. He didn't use formal language. He used plain language. Today, I applied the wheelchair securement protocol correctly and asked a mother and her disabled son to exit the vehicle. A group of passengers intervened. The situation was resolved without incident. I believe the protocol as written puts drivers in a position where following the rules correctly can still result in harm to passengers who are already vulnerable. I'd like to request a review. He read it twice. He sent it. He didn't know if anything would happen. He knew something had to be said. 11 years of following protocols without questioning them. Tonight he was questioning one. That felt like the right thing. It felt overdue. His daughter knocked on his bedroom door at 10. Dad. Yeah. The interesting day, she said through the door. Yeah, he said. Did you do the right thing? She said. He lay in the dark thinking about it. About the protocol. About Elijah. About crouching down to fix the lock. About the email. Eventually, he said. A pause. Okay, she said. Night, Dad. Good night. He heard her go back to her room. He lay there. Eventually was not the same as immediately. He knew that. He was going to do something about that too. They got home at 6:43. 13 minutes later than usual. Elijah noticed. He noticed everything. We're late, he said. 13 minutes, Diana said. Because of the bus, he said. Yes, she said. He thought about that for a moment. Then he went to wash his hands, the specific, unchanged routine of a child for whom routine was not habit but architecture, the structure that made everything else possible. Diana stood in the hallway. She listened to the water running. She exhaled. She made dinner, the same dinner she made every Friday. Pasta, simple sauce. The specific weekly constant that Elijah had decided 2 years ago was Friday food, and that she'd maintained without discussion, because some things didn't need discussion. He ate. She ate. Neither of them talked about the bus. She was waiting to see if he would bring it up. He was waiting to see if she would. They ate pasta in the specific, comfortable silence of two people who knew each other well enough to know that some conversations needed food first. He brought it up over dessert. She'd given him a small bowl of ice cream. Vanilla. He was eating it with careful, methodical spoonfuls. The girl, he said. Kezia, Diana said. She didn't know the name, but it felt right to give her one. She didn't have to do that, he said. No, Diana said. She didn't. He said. Diana thought about it. About Kezia pulling her headphones off. About the walk to the front of the bus. About the specific, unheroic courage of someone acting before they'd talked themselves out of it. I think she looked up, Diana said. And when she looked up, she saw us. And she couldn't look back down. Elijah ate a spoonful of ice cream. I saw her look up, he said. Diana looked at him. You saw? She said. She was looking at her phone, he said. Then she wasn't. He said it simply, like it was just a fact. Like he hadn't been watching the whole bus while pretending to look at nothing. Were you scared? Diana said. He thought about it. Honest consideration. No, he said. He said, no, she said. I was tired, he said. Tired is different from scared. She looked at her son. At 9 years old, making that distinction with complete precision. He said, it is. I didn't want to wait 40 minutes, he said. My legs hurt from PT. I know, she said, but I knew you'd figure it out, he said. She looked at him. You knew? She said. You always figure it out, he said. He said it the way he said true things, plainly, without decoration, as simple fact. She looked at her pasta. She looked at the wall. She looked at her son eating ice cream on a Friday evening after a day that had required more of both of them than Friday evenings should require. I didn't figure it out, she said. Other people helped. You let them, he said. She looked at him. What? She said. You let them help, he said. You didn't leave. You stood there. He spooned more ice cream. That's figuring it out. She sat with that. With a 9-year-old's version of what it meant to solve a problem. Not finding the answer yourself. Staying in the problem long enough for the answer to find you. The man with the cart, Elijah said. Yes, Diana said. He was scared, Elijah said. What makes you say that? She said. He looked at the boxes the same way you look at my chair, he said. Like if something happened to it, something would break that couldn't be fixed. Diana looked at her son. At the specific, particular attention he brought to everything. You're probably right, she said. I don't think he was bad, Elijah said. No, Diana said. I don't think so either. He moved it, Elijah said. He did, Diana said. That matters, Elijah said. What you do matters more than why you were slow to do it. She looked at him. Where did you get that? She said. He pointed at his book. The Phantom Toll Booth. Milo learns it in chapter 14, he said. She put him to bed at 8:30. Book on the nightstand, lamp off. She sat on the edge of his bed for a moment in the dark. Mom? Yeah, she said. The man who fixed my chair, he said. The driver, she said. Ray. How did he know it was broken? He said. He noticed, she said. Before or after? He said. She thought about it. Before, she said. I think before. Elijah was quiet. So he saw it and then he fixed it, he said. Yes, she said. Why didn't he fix it before? He said. She thought about that. About protocol and schedules and 43 passengers. And the specific calculus of a man doing a job that didn't leave much room for pausing. He was busy looking at other things, she said. And then he stopped being busy and looked at the right thing. Oh, Elijah said. A pause. That happens to me sometimes, he said. Yeah, she said. It happens to everyone. Good night, Mom. Good night, baby. She closed his door. She stood in the hallway. She thought about the day, about what it cost to navigate systems that weren't built for you, about the specific, accumulated weight of a lifetime of holding your breath in the 30 seconds before you found out which kind of person you were dealing with, about a Friday that had started ordinary and become something else, about a girl who looked up, about a man who crouched down, about a boy who watched everything and said almost nothing, and understood more than anyone knew. She went to the kitchen. She made tea. She sat at the table. She thought about tomorrow. 3 things happened in the week that followed, not in order of importance, in order of when they happened. The first was Kezia. She told her mother that night, not the whole story, the shape of it, the bus, the boy. The moment before she stood up, her mother listened. When Kezia finished, her mother was quiet for a moment. Were you scared? She said. Yes, Kezia said. Of what? Her mother said. Of being the only one, Kezia said. Her mother nodded. That's the hardest part, she said. Standing up not knowing if anyone's behind you. People stood. Kezia said. I know, her mother said. But you didn't know they would when you stood. Kezia thought about that. No, she said. I didn't, her mother looked at her. That's the thing about courage, she said. It only counts when you don't know the outcome. Kezia sat with that for a long time. She wrote it in her notebook, not the SAT prep notebook, the other one. The one she kept for things she wanted to remember. The second thing was Ray's email. It didn't disappear into a system. 3 days later, he got a response, not from the Transit Authority's accessibility office, from his union rep. I read your email. I've been thinking about this protocol for a while. You're not the first driver to raise it. You might be the first to put it in writing. Can we talk? They talked on Wednesday. For 2 hours, Ray told him everything. The protocol. Diana, Elijah, the passenger standing, the lock mechanism. The union rep listened. The protocol was written in 1987, he said. I know, Ray said. A lot has changed since 1987, the rep said. Yes, Ray said. We've been trying to get it reviewed for 3 years, the rep said. We needed documentation. A specific incident with specific details. He looked at Ray. You just gave us one. Ray looked at the table. At 11 years of following protocols without questioning them. At one Friday afternoon that had produced something he hadn't expected to produce. What happens now? He said. Now we file a formal review request, the rep said. It takes time. These things take time. He paused. But it starts. The third thing was Marcus. He went back to the weekend market on Saturday. He set up his cart. He arranged his pieces. The bowls, the cups, the small sculptures. He sold more than he'd sold in 3 weeks. Not because of what had happened on the bus. Or maybe partly because of it. He wasn't sure. What he was sure of was that he'd been different at the market. More present, less anxious about the pieces, more willing to talk to people. A woman had picked up a bowl and looked at it for a long time. Did you make this? She said. Yes, he said. How long does it take? She said. 3 days, sometimes 4. She looked at the bowl. She looked at him. You must love it, she said. He thought about the bus. About the boxes he'd been so afraid of damaging. About moving them carefully with Kezia and Thomas while 20 people stood and watched. About the fact that nothing had broken. Yes, he said. I do. She bought the bowl. She bought a cup too. He watched her carry them away wrapped in newspaper and thought about fragile things and how sometimes they survived more than you expected them to. Diana took Elijah to PT on Tuesday. Same route, different time, different bus. The wheelchair lock engaged cleanly. Ray's fix had held. Elijah read the phantom toll booth the whole way. He finished it at the last stop. He closed it. He held it in his lap for a moment. Good ending? Diana said. Yes, he said. Milo gets home. Is it what he expected? She said. No, Elijah said. It's better. He learned to see things he couldn't see before. Diana looked at her son. That's a good ending, she said. I'm going to read it again, he said. Already? She said. There are things I missed the first time, he said. She looked at him. At 9 years old, who had just finished a book and immediately wanted to read it again because he knew there was more in it than he'd found. She thought about Friday. About the things she'd seen for the first time that she'd probably missed before. About the people on a bus who had stood up. About what it meant that they had. About what it meant that she'd let them. Yeah, she said. Kezia got her SAT score 6 weeks later. Not perfect, good enough. She sat with the number for a moment. She thought about the bus. About the second before she stood up. About the specific, uncertain courage of acting without knowing the outcome. She thought about what she wanted to do with the next 4 years. She'd been planning on pre-law. Her parents wanted pre-law. She was still thinking about pre-law. She was also thinking about something she didn't have a full name for yet. Something about systems, about the gap between rules written in 1987 and the people those rules affected in the present. About the specific, structural ways that certain people were made to wait while everyone else moved forward. She didn't know yet what you called that as a career. She was going to find out. 6 months later, the Transit Authority announced a review of the wheelchair securement protocol. It would take time. These things took time, but it had started. Ray heard about it on a Tuesday. He was on his route. Bus number 23. He read the email at a red light. He put his phone down. He drove. That same Tuesday, Elijah started the phantom toll booth for the third time. Diana watched him open it at the kitchen table after school. Again, she said. There's still more, he said. He found his page. He started reading. She watched him for a moment. A boy with a book. The most ordinary thing. The thing she'd been fighting for all along. Not accommodation. Not protocol. Not the right forms filled out correctly. Just this, her son at a table, reading a book he loved for the third time, because there was still more in it. Subscribe if you're new. Share this tonight with someone who needs to hear it. And tell me in the comments, when was the last time you looked up? I read everyone. See you in the next story.